All righty. Good afternoon. This is John Freemont, Professor Adjunct Professor at San Antonio Theological College. This is going to be our second lecture for the class, First Enoch, and following our syllabus. We're going to just continue with our discussion on the biblical Enoch and the Mesopotamian Forbears. Okay. So just to recap, last time we came and we talked about the book of Enoch. We talked about the book. We talked about the historical context that the book of Enoch, the author is unknown. It is what it is called as a pseudo-apocrypha, right? A pseudo-apocryphy, meaning that the writer took on the name of a well-known biblical figure and gave it a title of the name of the book. We understand when we look at the historical context of the book of Enoch that the dating of the book can go back as early as 3 BC. All right, but we know that from the Qumran fragments that the book of Enoch was written in Aramaic. Some scholars say, they believe it was both either Hebrew and Aramaic, or the Aramaic was translated from the Hebrew. But being that this is the Second Temple period, after the Israelites come out of the exile, the main language at that time is Aramaic. Jesus spoke Aramaic and Hebrew, but the primary or the common language amongst the people, even the language as far as trade at that time, was Aramaic. And so the Aramaic fragments dated back to 170 BC. So if the Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, documents date back to about 170 BC. We know that the book is older than that, so we can put it around 3 BC, 2 BC. As far as the dating of the book of Enoch, it comes through what we call the intertestamental period, that's between Malachi and Matthew. I talked about how we call it the second 400 years of silence. But that during that time, God wasn't silent, but that these books were written and I believe inspired at this time during this intermediate period. However, the Jewish scholars at the Council of Jamia did not consider the book of Enoch and some of the books that's in the Apocrypha as inspirational. Mainly, and this is just my perspective, because of the Christian implications in the books, pointing to the fact that Jesus is the Messiah. And so the community that this particular text was written to was the post-exilic Jews, right? The Qumran family, those who were truly dedicated to the one true God. And so this book was addressed to that audience. So the second lecture, before we really get into the book of Enoch, where we wanted to talk about the authorship too, the dating when it was written. So even if you don't believe, even with the Bible, you have people that don't believe. What you cannot deny is that the Bible is a historical document, that we have these historical documents in museums and other places all over the world, that these are ancient documents. And so you cannot discard them as false. You can't discard what people believe because you don't believe. As the Hebrew Bible states in the Tessalem, or the book of Psalms, that the fool said in his heart that there is no God. Anyway, moving forward. All right, so the literary context or genre of the book of Enoch is something that I want to discuss, to give you a better understanding of what you're reading. And this is whether you're reading the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament corpus or Bible. You have to know the literary genre of what you're reading, the literary context, so you would know how the particular book that you're reading, how does it function. The Gospels, for example, are narratives. So the Gospels do not function the same way as an epistle, right? And then when you get to what we call the pastoral epistles, those are really letters, because it was addressed to an individual that was supposed to be read publicly. So, so you want to be able to look at the literary genre, because the Bible is actually an anthology. It's 66 books, for us who are Christians, it's 66 books. And so it's not just one book, it's a collection of books of God's revelation to God's people. Okay. So when we talk about then this particular genre, we have to understand that the Book of Enoch is what we call apocalyptic literature, based on Second Temple, and I'll discuss what Second Temple literature is. Basically, Solomon built the first temple, and I believe that was around 960 AD. Let me just double check. I think it's 960. I could be wrong. Check one of my sources here, Dr. Christine Hayes. Yeah, 961. All right, so I was great. So about 961, the first temple was built, and then 586 after the Babylonians come in, because in 722 BC, the Assyrians come in and exile the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes that God separated after Solomon's sin that he gave to Jeroboam, who then turned around and sinned, and they were exiled by the Assyrians. And then in 586, because of the people's constant idolatry and not following the law, the second exile happened in 586, and that's when the Babylonians actually destroyed the temple. And so about 520 to 515, after Cyrus gives an edict that the Jews can return to the province of Yehuda, which is called Judah, and this is where the name Jews came from. The Zerubbabel and the son of Shealtiel was commissioned to build the second temple. And so you're looking at a period of 500 BC to about 7 AD, because that's when the Jewish-Roman War happened in 7 AD, and the Romans destroyed the temple. Okay. And so the literature is happening about this time. All right. So apocalyptic literature, so like, for example, the Book of Enoch was originally written, as I stated, in Aramaic. Some argue Hebrew, and then it was translated, in Ethiopian language, Ethiopic, right? Now, some scholars argue that the Ethiopic version was based on the Greek translation of the Aramaic text, but some believe that the Ethiopian church actually translated from the Aramaic text, so it's in closer proximity to the ancient Near East as opposed to Greece. But that's something that scholars debate about all the time. All right, so so we have then this apocalyptic literature, originally written in Aramaic, and we know for a fact that the books of the Watchers, chapters 1 through 36, and then chapters 72 to 107 were written in Aramaic based on the Qumran Aramaic manuscripts that we have. Okay, so so this is just the scholarship behind it. And I just want to make you aware of it. You don't have to memorize it. You really have to really love this stuff to really get that deep. But I want you to be made aware that when we study the Book of Enoch, there's history here. We have manuscripts that's dating, and that this is a book that we should take seriously as Christians. We should take it seriously, but we don't. A lot of Christians are not aware of the book. But what is the apocalyptic genre? First of all, it can be found in the books of Ezekiel, Daniel, particularly chapters 7 through 12, right? Zechariah, particularly chapters 9 through 14, parts of Isaiah, chapters 24 through 27, then what scholars call third Isaiah, which is chapters 55 through 66, right? Yeah, 56, 65, okay. Yeah, in those areas. And then, of course, in the New Testament, we got the book of Revelation, okay? That is apocalyptic genre. Okay, so apocalyptic genre is mainly concerned with the coming judgment and salvation, right? So you need so judgment, salvation. So when we read the book of Enoch, we're going to see the judgment of the watchers and those who follow the practice of the watchers, who sin, practitioners of those things that are contrary to God's will, that God is going to bring into a final judgment on the last day. The literary genre was born out of persecution and a time of, if you will, of oppression. So this literature was, a lot of the apocalyptic literature is produced at a time when God's people were under oppression, times of persecution. So you have the exile, the post-exilic, when the Jews are returning to Judah, but then after that, after the Persian, you have the Greeks come along. After the Greeks, then you have the Romans that come along. And they come along, Alexander the Great, who came to Palestine in 3 BCE, and then so they were under oppression. And so these writers were inspired to encourage God's people that number one, God is still in control of history, and that God is going to bring history to a cataclysmic end, and that the righteous will be saved, and the sinners will definitely be punished. Okay. So apocalyptic literature is no longer concerned with God acting in history, right? But of a violent, radical end of the world. Good triumphs over evil. God has the final word. And this is based on the introduction to the Bible by Dr. Christine Hayes, who is a professor of the Hebrew Bible there at Princeton. Okay, watch this. Now, the other thing that's interesting about the apocalyptic literature and the genre is that the seer is told to write what they see. This is different because there's two prophetic streams that I talked about last week. You got the seer and you got the prophet. The seer sees visions. The prophet hears from God and speaks, right? But in the apocalyptic literature, you have a seer who is informed through dreams and visions, and this language is usually cryptic, meaning it has a hidden meaning, and it is very symbolic. And there's a great fondness of symbolic use of numbers, so I have to stress that because I had someone once said that the numbers don't matter in the Bible; they matter a great deal. But you have to really, when you study, you really have to ask the Holy Spirit to assist you in getting the revelation of what you're reading so that you can understand that there's some symbolism. Matter of fact, in the apocalyptic literature, you would notice that there's going to be a heavenly mediator who has to interpret the symbolism for the seer. Okay, so most apocalyptic works are attributed to important figures, like in this case, Enoch, and we're going to talk some more about who Enoch is. Okay, it's highly symbolic and employs bizarre and surreal images of beasts and monsters, usually depicted of foreign nations. Okay, you really find this in the book of Daniel and also in the book of Revelations. I just overheard a person talking about connecting the witch of Endor, which is First Samuel, to the book of Revelation, chapter 17. And this person just did not have an understanding of the literary genre of the text. Therefore, her hermeneutics were not sound. So this is why you have to make sure you understand literary context and do proper exegesis or whatever you're doing, right? So, so Apocalypse depicts a series of catastrophes, right, that signal the coming end. It divides humanity into two mutually exclusive groups: the righteous and the wicked. God will appear as an enthroned king who brings history to a crashing end. So when we study apocalyptic literature, this is how it's going to function, right? Okay, and then it says that you're going to find that this is going to be the judgment of the individual dead, followed by everlasting life and eternal punishment. All right, and it's a literature about despair, right? And that of what we call eschatological hope about the end times, Christian hope. When we look into the auspices of Christianity is a favorable, confident expectation. The expectation is that the righteous will be saved, the wicked will come to him, that the evil does not have the final say so. Okay, and so now when we're studying this book of Enoch, you also have to understand the theological or doctrinal issues. And in one of our objectives of this class is to relate this to the church. So, I've heard people who say they are prophetic, and I've had, mainly these some sisters who say they have prophetic gift, but they're like, I don't want doctrine, and so I was always trying to inform them doctrine is just really about teaching. It is about to affirm our beliefs as Christians or what we believe. There's a difference, of course, from the doctrine of men or doctrine or Christian doctrine, which is extrapolated from the actual biblical text. It's called biblical theology. Okay, so you need sound doctrine. Prophetic people, whether you're a seer or you operate a prophet, you need to know that you have to have sound doctrine, because therefore you won't understand what you're reading. The other thing about the prophets in these series, the prophets were writing prophets, so they were literate and they will write down the visions and what they will hear from God. And I have come across some experience that people don't like to write and don't really like to study, but don't really know how to operate in the gift, because you have to study to show yourself approved unto God, workmen who need not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth, according to 2 Timothy 2:15. So we talk about the theological undertone is eschatology, right? The study of last things, the study of end times, right? It's a study of end time. It looks beyond the historical timeline to a new heaven and new earth. And you're going to find these motifs throughout the book of Enoch, where Enoch is going to be translated, right, up into a door into heaven, and he's going to be shown all types of things, because God is showing him what he's going to do in the end. And so God commands him to write it and seal it into the Kairos, Greek time, or et, right? Hebrew word et, for an appointed time or season. Okay, so this is something about eschatology. When we talk about eschatology in the New Testament, when we're talking about Parousia, the coming of Christ, right? The eschaton, the last day. When we talk about the rapture, the Bible word is translated as translation, right? Being taken from one place to another. So when we talk about, pre-tribulation, mid-tribulation, post-tribulation, when we talk about the millennial, pre-mill, mid-mill, post-mill, that is all dealing with under the umbrella of eschatology, the study of last time. So the book of Enoch deals with last time, the study of last time. And what's interesting about this particular doctrine is that because as Christians, we live our life with a sense of urgency that, that Christ is coming back and that God is going to bring judgment on the earth, so that he can usher in his kingdom, a new heaven, new earth. But, with television evangelism, things like that, you got more people concerned about living life in this world. And the majority of the Christian church, body of Christ, is concerned about this world instead of the world that's going to come when Christ comes back. I just think that's interesting because, we want to buy bigger houses. We want to get bigger cars. We want more materialistic things instead of seeking to make sure we are in the vein of God's will, because Christ Jesus, Yeshua, Hamashiach, is coming back, right? He's coming back. Okay. And you're going to find, right, that in the book of Enoch, it's going to talk about the righteous one who is the chosen one. And you're going to see the title, the Son of Man, and the Head of Days, which is similar to what we have in the book of Daniel. So when we talk about eschatology, it's God's people's sin will be forgiven and forgotten, and the land will become an earthly paradise, blessed with peace, prosperity, and length of days. In other words, what God's original plan was in the book of Genesis, in the Garden of Eden. Eden was actually the mountain of God, where God met with his divine counsels. The garden was to the east of Eden, right? So the Edenic plan of God is going to come to fruition with the new heaven and new earth, that what God has declared is going to happen. Okay. Then the other thing, when we talk about eschatology, it says the curse of Eden, right, will be reversed. So what happened in Eden will be reversed. And so this is some of the tenets of eschatology. Now, eschatologies of, and I'm quoting for Dr. Christian Hayes here, eschatologies of an apocalyptic tenor speak of terrifying and cataclysmic end times. So I can understand why a lot of people wouldn't read the book of Enoch, because a lot of Christians are scared to read the book of Revelations. But in this course, I want you to kind of, be aware of what you're going to be studying, and that, and I really, because I've read it, and so of course I've read it, and I wouldn't be teaching the course, but it's going to blow your mind. It blew my mind, and a lot of it is predicting that that Christ is coming, and so that's what's fascinating about it. I went over the outline with you last week, and so we have the book of the Watchers, which is chapters 1 through 36. Okay. Then we got the book of the parables or the similitudes of Enoch, which is chapters 37 through 71. Then we have the book of the luminaries, or the astronomical book, chapter 72 through 82. And it's going to be a very interesting read when you read this, right? Then you got the book of dream visions, right, which is chapters 83 through 90. Then we got the apocalypsis of weeks, chapters 91 verses 11 through 17, which are compared to Daniel 9 verses 24 through 27. Then we have the epistle of Enoch, which is chapters 91, 1 through 10, 92, chapters 92 through 105. Okay, and then we have, of course, the birth of Noah, which is chapters 106, 107, which is a very interesting read that Noah has a miraculous birth, and that he undergirds his calling to preserve and save the human race. And that it is a salvation narrative that promises salvation to the righteous who will survive the great judgment of the deluge, the flood. Okay, and this is based on Dr. Michael Hazer's Reversing Herman is my source for this information. And then the last chapter, which is chapter 108, which we call Second Enoch. This chapter just provides a word that assures the salvation of the righteous and the damnation of the sinner. So that's kind of an overview of once again. So in this lecture, which is week 2 on your syllabus, we're talking about the biblical Enoch. Once again, we find Enoch in our Bibles. If we start in the book of Genesis, which I'm reading from my English Standard Version here, study Bible. Book of Genesis is really in chapter 5. That Enoch is the 7th. Adam being the first, Enoch is the 7th. And so what we find in chapter 5, right? And I look at verse 18 when it says when Jared had lived 162 years, he fathered Enoch. Jared lived after for the Enoch 800 years and had other sons and daughters, and thus all the days of Jared was 962 years, and he died. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God, and after he fathered Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters, thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Okay, so there, and we have the biblical Enoch, that he is the great grandfather of Noah, the father of Lamech, who and then fathers Noah. And what's interesting here, it says that Enoch, all the days of Enoch was 365 days. This is interesting because it points to when we get to the chapter, when we're talking about the astronomical book, right? The numbers, the book of the luminaries, right? In chapter 72 to 82, that 365 that he lived during, it's very symbolic. That's a symbolic number, or pointing to the fact that that is symbolic of his journey into the heavens, right? So we have that. So we know we got him there, that he walked with God. Now, there's a scholar by the name of Nahum Cerna, right? Nahum Cerna, and he did a commentary on the book of Genesis. And so the question is, what does it mean to walk with God, right? That because this is going to be a very important characteristic about Enoch and the understanding of first Enoch, right? That he walked with God. And I'm going to turn to the commentary, and I'm going to just give you what he Nahum Cerna state what walking with God means. And I thought it was interesting. I could have just wrote it down, but I thought I'd just read it for you. Okay, let me get here. All right. Okay, so what does it mean to walk with God? All right, now this is page 43 of his commentary. He says, walk with God. The regular formula, he lived, is replaced by the description of how he lived. So walking with God discuss how Enoch lived, So the question we ask ourselves when we study the book of Enoch, how Enoch lived, because of how he lived is the reason why he was translated, and he got to go into the mysteries of heavens, and God chose him to be able to see what man does not normally get to see. He says, now the idiom is used again only of Noah in chapter 6, verse 9, and in a slightly varied form of the idea of priest in Malachi 2:6. It is expressive of a life spent in full accordance with God's will and in close intimacy with him, end quote. So I just wanted to quote that from Nahum Cerna in his commentary on the book of Genesis. And says something when we're talking about the biblical Enoch is that, he pays special attention to God's will, and he walked with him with a close intimacy, and that's what it means to walk with God. And So we have that there. The other times that Enoch is mentioned from here is in the New Testament, and so then we go to the book of Luke, right? Go to the book of Luke, just to show. And this is Luke chapter 3, where we have now the genealogy of Jesus Christ. The pericope starts at verse 23, so Luke 3:23. And chapter 38. But so in the genealogy, which Luke does different than Matthew, he starts from Jesus to Joseph, then all the way to Adam. But here, but that's what Luke does. Matthew starts different. He starts with Adam and then comes down to Jesus. But so Enoch is mentioned here as in verse 37, the son of Methuselah, the son of Enoch, the son of Jared, the son of Mahalalel, the son of Cainan, and the son of Enos, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, the son of God. So Enoch is mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And then from there, we have quotes from the book of Enoch in a couple of books. And the first one, of course, is Second Peter, right? We talked about this last week. And so just to rehearse that before I go into this Mesopotamian stuff, Second Peter, chapter 2, if we start at verse 4, it says, if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept unto the judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald or a preacher of righteousness with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. So we have here, when Peter is writing this, he is writing this and quoting basically from what he read in the book of First Enoch. And then you have, of course, the book of Jude, Peter, who was one of the 12 who actually walked with Christ, one who got the revelation in Caesarea Philippi, declaring that you are the Christos, the Son of the living God, the Mashiach, right? He declares that. So this is a Peter who is writing this. So that tells us that the book of First Enoch was a part of their canon, their Bible of that time. Jude comes back, and then in Jude, and it's only one chapter, right? Verse 6, and the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains and gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. So we have Jude also writing, who's a half brother of Jesus, but then he actually gives a direct quote from the book First Enoch in verse 14. And he says, it was also about these that Enoch, the 7th from Adam, prophesied, saying, behold, the Lord, here's a direct quote, behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment on all and to convict all the ungodly of all their deeds of ungodliness that they have committed in such an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things that the ungodly sinners have spoken against him, end quote. So we see then, you have some Christians who say, oh, the book of Enoch is the book of devils and demons. And so they are uninformed individuals who are not even aware that the book of Enoch is actually quoted in your New Testament. So if you, for any other reason, if you don't read and study the book of Enoch, you should want to read it and see, why would Jude include it in his letter to the church? Why would Peter include it in his second year before he's about to check out and he's talking about what's going to happen? Now, here's one last thing I want to share with you when we're talking about the biblical Enoch and what has transpired from Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Most people don't understand it. Like I said, I'm working on my second book, and this is going to be a book about ungodly soul ties. But I want to deal with the biblical record. Most of the books that you're going to read find on Amazon, they allude to some scriptures, and they pretty much just formulating an argument, and it's not really biblically sound. Maybe more psychology than anything. But in my studies of the doctrine of God in the unseen world, which is another class that I teach, I have discovered something that most people just haven't come in grips with, right? But we'll talk about that. So at another time. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Some people have read this, and until I started really studying it deeply, I didn't quite understand what it meant either. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, he's talking about head covering, right? All right. And so I'm going to start at verse 9. 1 Corinthians verse 9 says, neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. This is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels, right? Most people have misinterpreted that scripture, and I mean, they have done a very poor job in understanding, knowing what the scripture is talking about. Here, Paul, see, this is what I'm saying, how Enoch is peppered throughout the New Testament, is referring to the sin of the watchers in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. In Genesis chapter 6, they're called B'nai Elohim, right? Sons of God, right? And but then when we get watchers from the Aramaic, which is in the book of Daniel, he calls them watchers. The Aramaic term is the Erems, right? The watchers, which were the sons of God. Because when you begin to learn the supernatural world and God's divine counsel and the makeup and the hierarchy in it, you understand the sons of God had a position. Then you have you got cherubim, then you got seraphim, and then you have angels, which were at the bottom of the hierarchy in God's divine counsel, because they are malach is the Hebrew term, which is messengers. Angelos, they were messengers, but other divine beings had different functions in God's supernatural world. And so here in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 10, it talks about this authority. So this is the things that you're going to be able to learn and begin to connect the dots by studying the book of Enoch. So the question is WIMF, right? What's in it for me to study the book of Enoch? What's in it for you? You'll have a better understanding of Jesus' purpose, right? Why Jesus come into the world? What was Jesus' purpose? His purpose was come to reverse what happened in Genesis chapter 6, to reverse the fact that the watchers descended at Mount Harmon. He's coming to reverse what happened there, because that's when the if you would, the effects of sin really took hold and began to affect mankind. Okay, now moving on from that, let's talk about the Mesopotamian forebears, right? Mesopotamia first, and this is quoting from the book Reverse and Herman from Dr. Michael Hayes. He says, and this is chapter, there is a Mesopotamian backdrop, right, to Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. So what I want to do, let's go ahead and read Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Let's go to the book of Genesis, of Bereshith. All right, let's go there. And now I'm reading from the English Standard Version on this. It says, when men began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God, B'nai Elohim, saw that the daughters of man, Adam, were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. So that tells me that this was something that was forced upon the daughters of men, that they picked, the ones that they chose. So it wasn't the women choosing them, so they chose them. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His day shall be 120. The Nephilim, right? The Nephilim, which is also translated as giants in some of your other translations, and sometimes it translated as fallen ones. Okay, but you have to do an etymology of the word, of the Hebrew consonant, nun, peh, and mem, to understand the etymology of what this word and what's the proper way to interpret it, right? So the Nephilim, or the giants, were on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons, B'nai Elohim, came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Okay, so when we talk about this strange passage in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, many people don't really know how to interpret it. They usually try to stay away from it. And so then we get the book of First Enoch that gives us some more information about what happened when these watchers, the Elohim, come down from their position, as you hear Peter and Jude talk about, from their position of authority, and they come and they commit this sexual sin by copulating with the daughters of men. Okay, and so the question is, watch this. This is what's so interesting. Is people saying, most pastors don't even deal with it, right? They just look over it and they come up with some obscure hermeneutic that's not even sound because they don't understand Old Testament scholarship. So when you study the book of Enoch and understand what's going on, when you study, took the class on Introduction to the Old Testament, I can only say it was my hope that your Old Testament professor also talked about the Old Testament parallel, Hebrew parallels of the ancient Near East documents that were discovered through archaeology and all that, but that the ancient Near East in which Israel fits. Okay, and here's the thing, right? Because this is sources outside of the Bible that confirms the Bible, right? It just didn't fall out the sky. Revelation from God does not come in a vacuum. God, who is a God who reveals himself in history, uses what's in the world to reveal himself to man. Otherwise, how would man be able to understand God's communication, God's self-communication, God's self-revelation, right? Self-disclosure. How would man be able? So he has to use what man understands to reveal himself in history. And so we're talking about now the doctrine of revelation, right? Doctrine of revelation. So you got general revelation, which is parallel, that is natural theology. Okay, and then you have special revelation. God acting here. So the word of God is God's special revelation. Okay, so he doesn't act in a vacuum. So now, so I'm talking about Mesopotamia, right? Mesopotamia documents. So I want to just point back here to my little map that I drew. Now, you would notice that my map, what you would see most maps, is upside down. And it's because, this is basically coming from the Comedian, right? From Kemet or Egyptian perspective when they look at the Akabulan or the continent of African that our European brothers call it, right? So upside down. So this is Africa, right? And notice it is south, north, east, and west. So south, north, east, west. Okay. So now the Egyptians, if you study the Medunetter or the hieroglyphics, what the Greeks call it, the Egyptians said that they came from the lake, what they call Lake Elizabeth, but it's around Kenya and Uganda and I believe it's Tanzania, from the mountain of the god called Happy, right? The Egyptians migrated from southern Africa or Akabila up the Nile River and eventually settled in Egypt, where the civilization reached its highest climatic development, right? Because the Nile, when the Nile flows down, it flows from south to north. Now, normally we always have our orientation from north to south, but here, and that's because this is Western thought. But in Eastern thought, from the original land, it was from south to north. The Nile River flows from south to north. Okay, so you have Africa here, and then right here is where you have Israel, right? And then over here is where you call Mesopotamia, the land of the two rivers, right? The Tigris and the Euphrates. And so over here, when we talk about the ancient Near East, that whole cultural context, we're talking about Babylon, Nineveh, which is Assyria. You got, and then, history tells you about summer, right? And the Bible calls that summer Shinar. And then Shinar is the band of Babylon. And then the Akkadians, right? In the Bible, it's called Akkad, right? And then you got Assyria and Nineveh here. So this is what we mean by the ancient Near East. And so through archaeological studies and digging, they found what's called cuneiforms, which was basically the Akkadian language of these ancient people. The Sumerians, right, which the Bible calls Shinar, or history tells you they were the first civilization who left writings and they wrote in pictures and things of that nature. And so that's where Sumer is over here. Babylon, or also Chaldea, is here. And then you got the Arcadia, right, which is Akkad in the Bible here. And then you got Assyria, you got Nineveh, the city of Nineveh, of course, along the Euphrates River here. So all of this is called the ancient Near East, and then you call this Asia Minor. Notice I'm not mentioning anything about Europeans, and these people were not Europeans. So and I have to stress that they were not Europeans. And so let me back it up in the text. So your assignment was to read, chapters 1 through 11. So if we go through the table of nations, right, in the Bible, and let's start at verse 6. And it says, the sons of Ham, Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. The sons of Cush, which is Ethiopia, Seba, Havilah, Sapta, Raama, Sapteka. The sons of Raama, Sheba, the queen of Sheba, Dedan. Cush fathered Nimrod, who was the first on earth. So Nimrod was the Ethiopian to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord, or Yahweh. The beginning of his kingdom was Babylon, Erech, Echad, Arcadia, Kalna, in the land of Shinar, summer. Okay, so and then, okay, well, I'm gonna stop there, right? Shinar. Okay, and from that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Keilah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Keilah. That is the great city. And then it says Egypt, father, Ludim, Anamim, Lahabim, and Naphtuhim. All right. And then Pathrusim, Kausluhim, from whom the Philistines came, and Caphtorim, so the Philistines, which that's interesting because that's one of David's biggest nemesis, right? They actually derived from Ham and from Mitzrayim is the Hebrew word for Egyptian, for the Egyptians in our Bible. So that's where they come from. So when we talk about this, then so these stories, right? These myths, as scholars call them, about what happened in Genesis 6 was not reserved or isolated just to Israel, but it was the story that started and circulated throughout the ancient Near East. Okay, so in other words, when we think about that this really happened, you got to understand, when you read the Bible, you can't read it from the 21st century perspective of a person from America, because it's a foreign language, it's a different language, but that there were sources, we call source criticism, where a lot of the stuff that we read in our Bible came from. Okay, so we just talked about that. So we talked about ancient and Near East. It's the cosmic geography in which Israel emerged, and it's important to truly understand your Hebrew Bible. And without your Hebrew Bible, one cannot understand the New Testament Bible. And so Michael Hayes, Dr. Michael Hayes, does a great job in reversing Herman to kind of introduce you to these Mesopotamian sources that gives you more insight and understanding of what the writer of Genesis is talking about in Genesis chapter 6, 1 through 4. The Mesopotamian stories have a different perspective on how they interpret this supernatural event that happened. And so the writer of the book of Genesis comes back and gives a correct theocentric, ethical, monotheistic perspective of what really happened here in Genesis chapter 6 through 4. So part of your assignment is to read chapter 3 and reversing Herman, just to get familiar with the Mesopotamian background of what happened, in Genesis chapter 6, verses 4 through 1. Okay, so just quoting here, one of the scholars by the name of Greenfield, he's going to talk about these particular characters called the Apkallu, right? Apkallu. This is in Sumerian is called Abgal, right? And I'm quoting. He says, in Mesopotamian religion, the term Apkallu, or Sumerian Abgal, is used for legendary creatures endowed with extraordinary wisdom, 7 in numbers, because there's that number 7. Even in other ancient Near East literature, the numbers matter, right? It's symbolic of something. Okay, 7 is the number. They are the culture heroes from before the flood. In the midst of the 21 poetises, the 7 Apkallu are Eridu, who are also called 7 Apkallu of Apsu, or at the service of Ea or Enki. This is the god, the name for the gods of the people of the ancient Near East, right? Okay. So it says a variety of risen tradition from the antediluvian period was supposedly passed on by the Apocalypse. So these particular creatures were the ones, the gatekeepers who passed down divine wisdom to mankind according to the Mesopotamian, what we call parallels to the Old Testament. And so when we get into the book of Enoch, you're going to find this parallelism because how the sons of God, they came down and they disclosed secret wisdom to their wives, and how this is how we got witchcraft, how we got weapons of war, which caused men to be extremely evil. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So it says these 7 sages were created in the river, Euphrates and Tigris, because that's where Mesopotamia was located. And Mesopotamia comes from the Greek, the land between 2 rivers. Okay. The 7 sages were created in the river and served as those who ensured the correct functioning of the plans of heaven and earth. Following the example of Ea, they taught mankind wisdom, social reforms, and craftsmanship. The author of the text dealing with omens, magic, and other categories of wisdom, such as medicine, is attributed to the 7 apocalypse. So there is this ancient document, from these ancient people that's talking about the term that they call the apocalypse, which is equivalent to B'nai Elohim in our Old Testament context. Now, I don't want to lose and go too much into this, because you if you're not familiar with it, you might get lost. And so basically, from a scholarship perspective, just want you to be familiar with this idea that this literature is out there, that there's other literature on why we have Genesis 6:1 through 4 in our Bible, and then how the book of First Enoch gives more insight in it, and that you have other we call extra biblical sources from the people of that area. Once again, the ancient Near East. Remember, this is Africa. Akabulan is what the natives called it. Akabulan, and then you got over here, of course, is Europe. That's Spain, and got Europe over here. But the ancient Near East is over here. Okay, where we got Sumer, Babylon, Akkad, or Arcadia, and Nineveh over here. Mesopotamia, the land between 2 rivers. All right, and so. Now, with that being said, I want to show you this because this is going to be interesting about reading the book of Enoch, and then I'll conclude with this. So going back to chapter 6 in the book of Genesis, okay, remember, the purpose, one of the purposes of studying the book of Enoch is that you're going to learn Jesus' true purpose. And his purpose was to come to reverse what happened at Mount Hermon. Okay, now watch this. So we read chapter 6, 1 through 4. Now, as we go from 5, it says, watch this. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart were only evil continuously. So the question when we study and we do proper exegesis, what was the turn of events where the Lord God made this judgment, Yahweh made this judgment that men became wicked and that this wickedness was great? This is where the book of Enoch comes into play, and it begins to explain to you some of the things that happened. For example, okay, let me see. All right. I'm going to read chapter 6, and this is from First Enoch. And it came to pass when the children of men had multiplied in those days, right? Where's my, yeah, all right. There it is. In those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, now here he's quoting from Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 to 4. And the angels, the children of heaven, B'nai Elohim, saw and lusted for them, and said to one another, come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men, and get us children. And Simjaza, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty for the great sin. And they all answered him and said, let us all swear an oath and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. Then swear they all together and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And they were in all 200 who descended in the days of Jared, which is whose father? Enoch's father, on the summit of Mount Hermon, which is where Caesarea Philippi is, according to Matthew chapter 16, verses 13, I think it was 18. Okay, and they called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. Okay, then it goes on to name some of these different divine beings that were a part of this blasphemy. And says, and then in chapter 7 says, and all the others together with them took unto themselves wives, and each of chose himself one, and they began to go into them and defile themselves with them, and they taught them charms and enchantments and the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants. Okay, so this is where they taught the women witchcraft. That's why, we look at our history, most of our history always have been against women and calling them witches. And if they were doing certain things, that they were doing witchcraft. And then verse 2, this is the first Enoch chapter 7, verse 2. And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants, Nephilim, whose height was 3,000 eels, who consumed all the acquisition of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds, beasts, reptiles, and fish, and to devour one another's flesh, and to drink the blood. Then the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. Okay. Chapter 8, it says, verse 1, and Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, and shields, breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth, and the art of working them in bracelets and ornaments, and the use of antimony, and the beautifying of the eyelids, and all kinds of costly stones, and all coloring tinctures, right? And there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they were led astray and became corrupt in all their ways. Simjaza taught enchantments and root cuttings. Armaros, the resolving enchantments. Barakilja taught astrology. Kokabel, the constellation, which comes also from the root of the Hebrew word for stars. Okay. Ezekiel, he taught the knowledge of the clouds. Arakiel, the signs of the earth, and Shamsiel, the signs of the sun, and Sariel, the course of the moon. As men perished, they cried, and their cry went up to heaven. Okay, so that's just some reading in First Enoch that gives you some more insight here. When we look at Genesis, and it says the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intentions of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continuously. So the book of Enoch gives us some more insight on why the Lord made that judgment of them. And then watch this. In verse 8 says, and the Lord regretted that he had made man on earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out men whom I have created from the face of the land, men and animals and creeping things and birds of heaven, for I am sorry that I have made man. But verse 8 says, but Noah found chain, grace or favor in the eyes of the Lord. That Hebrew word chain, favor. Okay. And then verse 9, then it gives you then the generations of Noah, right? Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God, and Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Okay, and then verse 11, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. God saw all the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And so chapters 6, 7, and 8 in First Enoch gives us some insight on the repercussions of what transpired in Genesis chapter 1, verses 4. All right. So that concludes the lecture on our second lesson here, which is the biblical Enoch continuing Mesopotamian Forbears. And that, so the Mesopotamian Forbears, they also have myths that are comparative, right? It's called comparative studies, biblically comparative study, where they take the Hebrew Bible and they're comparing what's in the Hebrew Bible to the ancient Near East parallels that have similar stories, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? Gilgamesh, you will find when you read the Mesopotamian documents, was considered an Akapulu, right? Then you got the Enuma Elish, when on high, something like that. I forgot what it was, but when, when on high, something when it began. But that's another story that is a parallel to the Old Testament. When we talk about Genesis chapter 1, chapter 2, first creation account, second creation account, and so as I bring this to a close, why is this important? it's important to study this because we have very many enemies of the Word of God who don't understand what they're studying, and they make particular claims about the Bible and about Christ as if they know the mind of God. And this is where I reserve, and when we study to do this in what is that, Isaiah what is it, 54, 55? I mean, I just preached on it. I should know this, right? Yeah. Yeah. Let me see what I'm looking at here. Yeah, 55. Where he says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord." It says, "As far as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." And what's interesting to me, the opponents of our faith, they go to Egypt, they learn how to read hieroglyphics or myth of the Medu Neter, and they get the myth of Osiris and Horus and Isis, the names that the Greeks call them, but that was Henru, which is Horus, Aset, which is Isis, and Ansar, which is Osiris. But the Kemetic names are Ansar, Aset, and Heru, right? The Trinity, what we call the Trinity, that was there. They do not consider the fact that God has always revealed His plan to mankind, and so even though we find it written in stone, all it does is justify what God was ultimately going to do through Christ. For in the book of Matthew, it says, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." So they missed that, right? And so anyway, I hope this is something that's going to be beneficial as you continue to study and read the book of Enoch. And so you should have read Genesis chapter 1 through chapter 11, especially chapters 4:17 through chapter 6 and verse 9. Then you got to read chapter 3 on the book of Herman, which I've made a copy for you. And then continue for next week is to go ahead and start reading the book of Enoch and read chapters 1 through 36. And then we're going to discuss that on the next lecture. All right. So God bless. I hope this was a blessing to you, and we'll be seeing you again. Peace.